And hello, welcome to this video. So in this video I want to go through some examples, at least in Microsoft, how DbContext is used. Okay, so we try to go through it quickly. So last video we already talked about the overall framework of how DbContext is used. So basically we make our own DbContext class, and this DbContext class will then interact with the underlying MariaDb database to do our CRUD operations, which is create, read, update, and delete. Okay, so to make our own AppDbContext, okay, so why are we making AppDbContext? We are making AppDbContext so that we can sort of make our own what do you call that? Let's see, component. You see, we have a component repository. Okay, we have our own component repository in RAM. Okay, and this actually interacts with the list. Okay, so we eventually want to make our own component repository for MariaDB, and this will contain all the functions to interact with the underlying database right here. And to have those functions, we need to first make our own AppDbContext, and this AppDbContext will then be used as a dependency injection. Okay, you will sort of shove this AppDbContext. Okay, you will shove this AppDbContext into our own component repository class using MariaDB, and then you will use AppDbContext, let's say, to create components. So for example, if you want to make a component here, you would say this.AppDbContext something, you'll add the component to the AppDbContext object, and then you will do the save changes and everything as well, because AppDbContext likes to have this save changes method as well. Okay, so the whole point of having AppDbContext is so that you can use it over here to put it inside the component repository. So instead of using RAM, you use MariaDB. Okay, the difficult part is to configure AppDbContext. It can be very challenging if you're doing it for the first time. So that's why I want to walk you through. Okay, so I'll show you the process, which I used to learn myself. So the first place you can visit is this documentation of entity framework call. Make sure you're on entity framework call DbContext. Okay, so DbContext usually it's something we use to it is usually injected as a scoped service. Okay, so over here under ASP.NET Core model view and controller MVC, we use this services.addDbContext. Okay, services.addDbContext. So this is the syntax we use, the conventional syntax. We use it to add our application DbContext. This is our custom DbContext class we are talking about just now. And remember, this custom DbContext class will need its own dbContextOptions, which is right over here. Alright, so the options will be, this is the dbContextOptions, and this dbContextOptions will have a lot of other functions in there as well, so that you can configure, okay, so that you can configure how to connect to your database. Alright. And a sort of detail I missed out in the last video, dbContextOptions also contains information of what kind of database you are connecting to. Alright, so for example, right here, this options class will be such that it uses the SQL Server, the Microsoft SQL Server, but we will not be using Microsoft SQL Server, we will be using MariaDB server. Okay, so pardon, that was I think it was some advertisements just now. Okay, I think I better close this page. I'm not going to use this. Or maybe, yeah, I'll close this page. That was very disrupting. But anyway, yeah. Okay, I will just keep continuing the recording. That was a bit annoying, but okay. So, yeah. So DbContext, okay, you will configure it using AppDbContext. Or, well, if you're more comfortable, you can also inject DbContext manually as a scope service. I've done that before. Okay, if you can also add your DbContext as a service, and you provide your interface and implementation right here. You can inject it manually using this add scoped as well. However, there's the standard way to do it is to use this AppDbContext or AppDbContextPool. There are two kinds of classes that can do this scope service dependency injection for you. Okay, but if you see this add DbContext, don't just know that this is a way of adding our DbContext, our customized DbContext as a scope service. So this is after we configure all the DbContext and everything, we can then inject it over here, or we can inject it over here and of course put all the DbContext options over here as well. That's what this line of code is for. Okay, it tells it configures the DbContext options. All right, it configures DbContext options so that it will use SQL Server, and then you will have this thing called a connection string here, and the connection string here is basically a string, a block of text telling you how to connect. What's your username? What's your password? What's the port number? Etc. etc. Okay, so that's what's going on here. Okay, and as you can see, there are many ways of pushing this DbContext options. So you can see DbContext options. We are actually pushing it into the constructor of the application DbContext. Okay? So remember, we are making our own customized DbContext class. They like to call it application DbContext. It will then inherit from the DbContext, and what you need to sort of shove into this application DbContext is that you need to put this DbContext options. Okay, DbContext options, you need to shove it into the constructor. You need to shove it into the constructor of the application DbContext, and not only that, you need to shove it into the constructor of DbContext as well. Okay, why do you have this base keyword here? This base keyword is referring to the class. Okay, base means underlying thing, right? It's where you where you derive the class from. Okay, what's the base class of DbContext? It is the class where it's inherited all its functions, all its methods from. So in this particular case, DbContext is the base class of application DbContext. Okay, so this base, when you see this base here, you see this colon base thing here. Okay, base is will refer to DbContext. Okay, so whenever you see base here, you will refer exactly to DbContext. So it's as good as you copying DbContext and you kind of so-called paste it here. And what is the method that has the exact same name as the class itself? It is the constructor. Okay, so what you're doing here is to inject. Okay, you're shoving in, or I think the proper word is injecting. Maybe I should not use shoving in. You're injecting DbContext options both into the application DbContext class and also the DbContext class itself. Okay, so this part's about controllers, we can just ignore it. Okay, so this one is kind of syntax you may or may not be familiar with. I wasn't that familiar when I first started with this kind of base keyword. Okay, I'm pretty noob at this, but okay, we can use something a little bit more intuitive. Okay, so we can have a DbContext initialization with new. So what's going on here? So remember, DbContext, okay, your application DbContext, it must have the DbContext options class injected into it so that it can function properly. All right. So one of the ways is to use this base options thing, so that this DbContext options is properly injected into DbContext, so that the DbContext is properly configured. Okay, so remember these options right here. These options right here will contain all the data of how to log into your server, your database server, and also all the information of what kind of server this is. Is it a MySQL server? Is it SQL server? Is it some other kind of server, or MariaDb? Okay, all of this will be under the DbContext options. Okay, and you need to inject it into application DbContext and DbContext. Okay, now there are a few ways of doing it. We can use the dependency injection like this, so that you pass it into both of their constructors, or maybe you use something a little bit more familiar. Okay, if you are already familiar with dbContextOptionsBuilder, okay, dbContextOptionsBuilder, all right. So we will do it like this. Okay. Right here we actually pass in dbContextOptions object, and over here instead we can do it another way as well. We can configure this dbContext another way as well. Instead of passing in the dbContextOptions, we pass in the dbContextOptionsBuilder object. Oh yeah, I'll just throw you another thing, right? Yeah, so remember the dbContextOptionsBuilder object only exists there to create a new dbContextOptions. So that's what it's supposed to do. Okay. So if you're not sure what dbContextOptionsBuilder is, it's right here. dbContextOptionsBuilder. You see that this dbContextOptionsBuilder class or whatever becomes the type of this options builder. And dbContextOptionsBuilder has a few methods. One of them is called SqlServer. UseSqlServer. All right. So let's. So whenever you put this UseSqlServer, dbContextOptions will then return an instance of dbContextOptions. Okay. Let me explain. All right. So I'll go down that first before talking about this OnConfiguring thing. Okay, so we are looking for this thing called UseSqlServer. Okay, so you'll see several versions of this. These are when you have several functions that are the same name but taking different inputs. This is known as overloading. Okay, method overloading. Okay, method overloading is basically if you have the same function but you take in like different inputs, you are essentially overloading the function. So for example, you see this add function here. You have two integers which are added, and then this integer, well, if you just leave your add function like that, it can only take in two integers. But when you perform addition, you can perform addition using two or more integers. It can be three integers, it can be floats, doubles, anything you want, right? So the way to increase the functionality is to do this thing called overload. So this is how we make an add function normally in C#. However, the moment we say, okay, maybe I want a version of my function or a version of my method or function which takes in three parameters, three integers, and then adds them all up. Okay, so I'll add the functionality like that. So you not only have a version of the add function that adds two integers, you also have a version of the function that adds three integers or four floats. Okay, so when you keep defining the function like that, and you define it in such a way that if I have different inputs, the function behaves differently. Okay, if you do things like that, this is called overloading. Okay, so we see the example of the overloading right here. When it says UseSqlServer, when you see this thing called UseSqlServer, it can take in several kinds of what do you call that? Inputs, and then depending on the inputs, it might give you different outputs or it may behave differently. So right, you have this thing called UseSqlServer. Okay, UseSqlServer. If you open this in a new tab, okay, it will return a dbContextOptionsBuilder. Oh, okay, pardon me. It returns a dbContextOptionsBuilder. It doesn't return a dbContextOptions object. Okay, so my bad. I mixed that up a little bit. So okay, what's going on? All right. So this when you pass in a new dbContextOptionsBuilder, this dbContextOptionsBuilder is kind of an empty, unconfigured version. Okay, but the moment you use this, you have this thing called UseSqlServer. This dbContextOption actually returns the object, returns a dbContextOptionsBuilder object, which is now configured with a proper strings, okay, with the proper servers to use. For example, here it says UseSqlServer, okay, and then it will have all the correct information to connect to your database server. Okay, so the only thing to deal with here is the OnConfiguring method. and this method will take in the a blank dbContextOptionsBuilder, and what happens is that it will then you will then be able to configure the dbContextOptionsBuilder class by using this UseSqlServer class. Okay, for MySQL, for MariaDb, we use a different class, and it's in manual entity framework call, but we will not go there yet. Okay, so this is the only thing we need to do to configure our dbContextOptionsBuilder. Okay, once you override this on configuring, so okay, what is this override all about, right? Okay, so under dbContext, okay, under dbContext you will have some source code called onConfiguring, right? So you can look in the dbContext source code. Okay, you can look at the dbContext source code, dbContext EFCore source code. Okay, it will be in GitHub, and then okay, you can go and look for the class itself, the class definition. Okay, I do not know where the class definition is, but it should be under source. Maybe you can go into EFCore. Okay, oh, dbContextOptions.cs or dbContext.cs. dbContext, what am I looking for? Okay, I'll show you how to navigate first. So you come to the GitHub. Usually all the source code will be placed under src. That's how they are organized here. Then you can go into entity framework call. Okay, why am I doing entity framework call? Because all of these things are like, you know, other, I mean, so-called, I guess when you design things, you want to have add-ons, you put it into other folders, but your main files you put under the most simply named folder, the folder with the simplest name, and this is just entity framework call, and your dbContextOptionsBuilder, dbContextOptions, and dbContext CS classes, they'll all be here. Alright, so what was I looking for? I totally cannot remember, but yes, the onConfiguring, yeah. So onConfiguring will be in dbContext. Okay, so this is the source code. It will have all this stuff here. You can just ignore everything. Look for onConfiguring. Okay. So they will tell you here that onConfiguring will be, yeah, onConfiguring is kind of decided here. So it will be run, so to speak. Hold on. Yeah, okay. onConfiguring is right here. It's a protected internal virtual void. Okay. So what is this? What's going on here? Okay. onConfiguring is a way for you to configure your dbContextOptionsBuilder. Alright. It's a way for you to configure your dbContextOptionsBuilder using whatever template you want. You can put all your connection strings in here. You can tell them to use UseSqlServer, MySqlServer, all of these things here. And this is what this onConfiguring thing is for. It's a void class, and yeah, it's a void class, meaning to say it does not return anything. But the only thing here for you to do is to, well, it is basically here. I mean, you can copy this template and then you paste it into your code. Yeah, what you're doing is to override this function, because this function basically doesn't do anything. But the moment you do this override, okay, you do this override thing right here. The moment you do this override, this function here will not be used anymore. Okay, this function will not be used anymore. Instead, you will have your dbContextOptionsBuilder being used here. Okay. Now the specifics of how this options builder is then passed back to dbContext and then how the code actually works, I will not go through it. I myself don't know, but I know that to receive the dbContextOptionsBuilder, or rather to configure dbContext itself, you can inject your dbContextOption by two ways. One is to pass in a dbContextOptionsBuilder object. Alright, and then you configure your dbContextOptionsBuilder. Okay, dbContextOptionsBuilder. So this is this code right here, dbContextOptionsBuilder. Okay, you configure the DbContextOptionsBuilder, and eventually it will give you DbContextOptions within that code somehow. Okay, alright. So this is one way of doing it. It to me is more intuitive than this because over here we will have an application DbContext. It will have a DbContextOptions, and then you need to pass in the type of the DbContextOptions. The type of the DbContextOptions, okay, means to say that okay, this DbContextOptions is specifically for one application, one sort of DbContext. So you need to pass in the your custom DbContextOptions type into this DbContextOptions type over here. So this DbContextOptions, it will need to be specific to a specific application DbContext. So yeah, again, this DbContextOptions can only be used for one type of database context. So in this case is this application database context class. So that's why you kind of put your class type and then you kind of put it in here. So this will become the full type. This is the type of DbContextOptions. What this DbContextOption does is that it is a DbContextOptions that is specific to this class itself, Okay, this DbContextOptions right here only can be used for this class. So this is what this statement is somewhat saying. Okay, but when I first looked at it, of course it confused me. Why am I making a class, and then why am I passing the class as an input into this DbContextOptions? Okay, at first it may not seem intuitive. So if you don't want to deal with this angular bracket notation, okay, then what I did is, okay, instead I use this OnConfiguring thing, where instead I pass in empty DbContextOptionsBuilder and I configure it within this OnConfiguring block of code. Alright, so yeah, that is it. Okay, and the third way, of course, the third way itself, the third way, instead of building your DbContextOptions over here, you can actually build it outside the class. So you can see here, okay, your DbContextOptionsBuilder, okay, your DbContextOptionsBuilder, it will be, you have to pass it as you have to type it as your specific DbContext right here. Again, you have to use this angular bracket notation, which the first time I looked at it, it just confused me. I don't know what's going on here. But this DbContextOptionsBuilder uses MySqlServer. Okay, it calls the UseSqlServer. It calls this UseSqlServer function. And what this UseSqlServer function is that it just returns another. It returns a DbContextOptionsBuilder object, but instead of, I mean, it's really a bit confusing, right? UseSqlServer is a method that is part of the DbContextOptionsBuilder, and then the whole thing it returns is this another DbContextOptionsBuilder. So what's the difference? The original DbContextOptionsBuilder may not be properly configured. This object itself may not be properly configured, but the DbContextOptionsBuilder that is returned by this UseSqlServer method or class is properly configured. Okay, meaning to say it has all the connection strings, it has the port number, it has the username, the password, everything, all the data that's needed to connect to your database server. Alright, so it returns the builder class, and if you take a look here, okay, once you have this options, why is this options being called? Okay, the options or in a DbContextOptionsBuilder, it is a property of DbContextOptionsBuilder, meaning you can get it, you can set it, but you can see that this options builder property, it is a DbContextOptions type. Okay, so remember I was saying before, DbContextOptionsBuilder actually builds the DbContextOptions, which you then can put it into the DbContext. Okay, we can see how the code is used here. Alright, we can see how the code is used here like this. First thing first, we make a DbContextOptionsBuilder class. We run the SQL Server code on it, or the UseSqlServer object. So actually, yeah, this line of code here, a lot of things are going on. You can actually separate it into 4 lines of code. firstly, we are actually declaring a DbContextOptionsBuilder object. Next thing is that we use the SQL Server. We have a UseSqlServer method being called so that the DbContextOptionsBuilder is configured properly. And the third thing, once the DbContextOptionsBuilder thing is configured properly, you then retrieve the options property here, and then this is the options property, which is a type of DbContextOptions build, a type of DbContextOptions. Okay, this is a DbContextOptions type. Where is it? My goodness, too many tabs open. Okay, so this DbContextOptionsBuilder property is of the type DbContextOptions. So you manually make this DbContextOptions first. So we have this context options, and this context options will then be manually injected into our application DbContext. Okay, so application DbContext is the class that we have here. We will have this application DbContext over here, and then we can inject this context options right here, and this will be your new application DbContext object, which we can then use to perform our create, read, update, and delete. Okay, that was quite the mouthful. Okay, so we actually have a few ways. Right, so again, all this code may seem confusing, but the main thing is that, okay, we are passing our configuration information into our DbContextOptions. Either pass it into the DbContextOptionsBuilder so that it can build the correct DbContextOptions, or you build it yourself or something like that. Then we send it into the DbContext. Okay. All right. So, yeah. So these are some ways of configuring it. The way I prefer, my personal preference sometimes is to use the DbContextOptionsBuilder because it makes the code a little bit more readable, slightly. I say slightly. Or else, if you pass in the DbContextOptionsBuilder object or DbContextOptions object into here, you either configure it through injecting this context options here, or you use this very long line of code here to confirm, or rather to configure your DbContextOptions inside your dependency injection. Okay, if you take a look at this line of code, there are basically a lot of things happening here. Okay, so we are adding the DbContext as a scope service, and then this is our DbContext, our custom DbContext class. Okay, and then this DbContext class will need a DbContextOptions as I said before. So how do we configure the options? So this is an option such that, okay, options.UseMySql blah 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 okay, so UseMySql is very similar to UseSqlServer. It will return you a DbContextOptionsBuilder object, and then this UseMySql thing will actually need another set of options. Okay, how to configure your SQL server. This is a MySqlOptions object, which is another layer of complexity. Now, do I want to do all these steps here? Okay, do I want to do all these steps here? You see that you have a server version, you configure your server version, you configure your code, everything here. Do I want to do it like that? No. Okay. Reason being, when I read this code, I am totally confused as to what's going on. Okay. Though of course this is the standard way of doing things. A lot of people like to configure their DbContext inside the dependency injection part, where we put all the services, we add scope, then we add DbContext, etc., etc. Well, maybe eventually we'll get there when we'll just shove so many lines of code into one line, but it really makes the code not readable, very hard to understand what's going on. Okay, so I rather take it step by step. Okay, what are we having? We are having a DbContextOptionsBuilder. We are adding those options in. We tell it what server to use, how that server is configured, what are the username, password, and then after that, after you finish the step, then you make the DbContextOptions. Then after that, you inject it into DbContext itself. Okay, when we break it down step by step, it's really a lot easier to understand. Then us staring at this code, trying to figure out what's going on. Okay. Right. So hopefully this helps you a little bit more with some live code example and documentation as to how the DbContextOptions, dbContextOptionsBuilder, and dbContext are related to each other. Okay, so that's all with the documentation. All right, so hopefully next time we will talk about real life. Yeah, I'll demonstrate. Okay, I'll demonstrate.